Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending today. We're just going to give it a couple minutes and wait for people to join the webinar. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Just waiting for everyone to join the webinar. We'll be kicking off in a few minutes. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. A couple minutes, we'll be kicking off live. Hi, everyone. Just waiting for people to join the webinar. We're going to be kicking off in just a minute. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. My name is Brendan Fournier. I'm the program manager for UMass M2D2, and I'm happy to have Abbas here, who is the CTO of Galen Data, who's going to give a presentation today discussing the key considerations for medical device cloud connectivity. We do have the chat and Q&A open, so please feel free to ask any questions and share your thoughts, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. And with that being said, I will turn it over to Abbas.
Thanks, Brennan. Hello, everyone. My name is Abbas, and thanks for joining this webinar. Just a quick background on me. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Galen Data. I have about 17 years experience, almost all of that in software development. 15 of those years has been in healthcare software development in terms of helping either small startups or large medical device companies across different kind of modalities. Also different kind of software development platforms, embedded, mobile, cloud, and others. Today, I'm going to talk about some of the important aspects that you need to think through when trying to pursue a medical device connectivity. Before we do that, I would like to talk about some of the benefits of why you would want to even consider having cloud connectivity. So some of these, most of these are straightforward. For example, remote monitoring. Think use cases like telehealth. So if your device is connected, it can be suited for telehealth options. You kind of see that benefit in the current environment. We see a lot of interest in those kind of devices right now. Also, if you track patient compliance, connectivity can be useful. So for example, a lot of Medicare reimbursements are tied around how much does a patient use a device, how much does a patient use a therapy. And tracking that usage is important for reimbursement. Having a connected device just makes it much more efficient to do that. Also, higher reimbursement there are ways to kind of increase your reimbursement by either proving that your coverage is better or that your device or therapeutic is more efficient. And you can do that with data. And data is useful right now with insurance coverage options. But also FDA has a program, it's a pilot program called NEST, where they're essentially using, what they're saying is that they will use real world examples or real world evidence, RWEs, to eventually allow your devices to be used for an alternative use case. So for example, let's say your device was approved for one thing, for monitoring or for therapeutic in kind of one indication. But if you have some secondary indications, essentially going to market with that first indication and then using that data to kind of prove that secondary indications are there may allow you to kind of skip a lot of the clinical trial aspects, which can be very cost effective. So that again allows capturing that data early on can be very useful. New business models. Data opens up new business models. We see a lot of diagnosis as a service right now. For example, the COVID at-home test is one quick example. There are other kind of examples like that, where you have algorithms that essentially do a lot of diagnosis, and you have devices that collect data in person. So I'm a direct patient model. We also see device as a service model. So traditionally, devices are sold to mostly large hospitals or clinics upfront with upfront costs, but we see kind of a move towards essentially leasing a device and essentially charging as a per use model. It helps in a couple of ways. One is it makes a more business sense from a sales perspective. You can go into the hospital and say, hey, look, you don't need to pay this upfront cost. Your cost is kind of amortized over a large time period. It just gives you an advantage of that. But to do that, you have to be able to connect the device and track usage because your billing is that way. And then the last one I want to talk about is kind of what we call device surveillance. So think of connectivity being useful for your internal teams, your internal engineering teams or your quality teams. So if your device is ever has an issue, you can kind of keep track of device health, maybe even do some predictive maintenance on it. Or if you have issues in the field that your engineering team needs to have access to kind of the logs or basic device data, they can do that pretty easily if your device is connected. Also, if you need any kind of, if you have, let's say, a complaint or some kind of corrective action that needs to be implemented on the device, a lot of the data that you collected can give you a good idea of what's going wrong and how to fix that. So those are kind of the some high-level benefits of connected devices. But how do you, when you start a connected device journey, what do you do? So that's what we're going to talk about, essentially what we call a path to cloud connectivity. The things like defining the requirements, what considerations to take into account for hardware, for software, for regulatory considerations, how to manage that, and then very important security and privacy consideration as well. And the last, once you decide connectivity, do you build it in-house or do you go buy either an existing solution or maybe a parts of the solution that you can build upon? So we're going to go touch all these areas in this presentation. So starting with defining a need, this is kind of straightforward. You need to know what you're building, so kind of requirements. And most people do this naturally for any kind of project. But what I want to emphasize right now is a little bit more around the use case, the user story, how the user is going to use it. And remember, the user can be, most often is patient or providers, but think of other use cases and consider a broader set of use cases. Does your internal teams need access to those data? How are they going to be using that particular connectivity aspect? What about payers? What about researchers that you may want to partner with? So kind of one thing we see is people getting very narrowed down into either the practitioner or the patient use cases, but forgetting about some other use cases. So try to always be a little bit broader, even if you don't implement a lot of those use cases in your kind of V1 of your connected journey. And then second thing we want to emphasize is, because patients and providers are generally the most the most important stakeholders, I guess, in a connected in a device world, make sure that interactions are understood. And I say that because if you don't take into account the workflows of practitioners and workflows of patient and how you design your connected digital offering, it becomes very hard to actually sell that, or bring them on board. So think of that workflows. Think of workflows for other stakeholders as well. And then, as I said, consider some payers, compliance, and engineering teams. Once you define the need, the next thing is to kind of define the data. Like, what data will you need to collect once you have these use cases? So if your use case is, diagnostics, so what kind of data you need, what kind of algorithms you will need to be able to run those data against, and then what is the output that a patient may want to see or a practitioner might want to see, and what are the outputs maybe other stakeholders may want to see. So kind of think through that, define your data. Also think, how are you going to collect the data? How much data will stay on the device? How much will be moved off the device? It becomes important, especially in terms of, always consider you may not always have connectivity. So how much data you can potentially keep it, potentially offload it. All that becomes important because once we start into hardware, you will see these things manifest themselves. Does the device need historical data? Is the algorithms running on the device? Do they need to know prior patient history, any of that stuff? If so, how much? How long you intend to keep in this data? Again, there's privacy and security considerations around that. Who should have access to what data? You may not want every piece of data to be available to everyone. You may only want to, maybe if you're processing data, maybe only the process data should show up to a practitioner. Maybe the raw data is only for internal teams. When do they need access to data? Again, that workflow aspect is super important. Again, if the data is not available when they need it and in the form they need it, it becomes hard to kind of convince people to use the system. And then last is data anonymized, or can it be anonymized? Again, those are questions related to privacy and security, but those are the kind of questions you ask to kind of understand what data to collect. Right. Also consider what you need now versus what you consider as you grow. Sometimes it becomes harder to make hardware changes. So if you think you need data in the near future, that you may want to consider that upfront. Also, as complexity grows of a device, consider what that does in terms of performance of the device, in terms of kind of cost of the device. So all that is kind of intertwined aspects of data collection. And one more thing I want to talk about is the responsibility once you start collecting data. So kind of the first part was figure out what data you need. Second, what data you should really have, because there's a balance there between security, privacy concerns, and then having more data to be able to do certain things. So again, understanding your responsibilities, conduct a thorough risk analysis, and ask questions. What happens if the data is altered or deleted? What happens if what is the harm to the patient or to any end user? Consider the risk, but also consider the benefits of having the data. It's a balance. You always want to maintain that balance. Not having data gives you a very good risk reduction, but then it doesn't really help you. Having lots of data may be too much risk on your hand. So it's a gray line, but you can kind of try to put focus on that. And remember, it's not just about having connectivity for the sake of connectivity. It has to actually give you a benefit, or give the end user or your stakeholder some benefits, right? So whatever risk answers to you, also consider that aspect. Does a patient really need that data? And if so, how do you improve having that data? How does it improve their therapy, their satisfaction, their compliance? And that itself is a benefit, even though you may have some risk around that. And then, as I said, it's a balance. So let's talk about that. So once you kind of define the data and the use case, now you start figuring out, okay, how do I actually implement that? And so implementation requires consideration of 4 different aspects. We always start with the hardware, because in the device world, most devices are hardware. You can have software as a medical devices, and we'll talk about that when we get to the software aspect. But if you are using hardware devices, you need to kind of understand what additional constraints or additional requirements is a digital health aspect of your offering is going to put on, right? So things to consider is factors that will influence the connectivity hardware. So for example, things like space. How much physical space do you have? Because that affects any kind of antenna you need, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, something like that, or cellular, what kind of storage as requirements or storage constraints you will have, what kind of memory you will have, how much power you will have. So space, if you have an embedded implantable devices versus a big box that sits next to a patient's bed, those are very two different constraints in terms of connectivity. Power, again, how much power you can provide to the connected side of the hardware that will influence the kind of frequency of data transfer, amount of storage, kind of what transfer protocols you will use, whether it be low powered, high powered kind of stuff. How much processing capability will dictate how much data you collect, process, and transfer. And then what, again, is the use environment, right? So if a device operates in a hospital versus operates in a patient's home, those factors influence the hardware quite a bit. In a home, you may have to contend with maybe poor Wi-Fi, not guaranteed proper connectivity. In a hospital, you may have to contend with a lot of noise, security requirements in terms of network, and so on. So just kind of think through that as well. So operating constraints, frequency of data delivery. This is important because the more frequent you need, the less storage you will require potentially in your hardware, but also that it means that you need better bandwidth and better latencies and stuff like that. Again, a lot of this is interconnected, so frequency will affect bandwidth to some degree, and vice versa. And then again, how device interacts with the patient is important, with the user, with the patient or provider. So the workflow aspect, again, because if you need, for example, the user to be able to have access to data directly on the device, now you put together additional requirements in terms of displays, in terms of maybe an ability to share and stuff like that. Okay, so once we talked through hardware consideration and kind of figured out, the next thing to think through is software consideration. Just like hardware choices, you want to understand the impact your software choice will have on connected products. So for example, it's very common to use what we call free open source software as building blocks in software development. Now, for compliance and security purposes, you need to ensure that these software libraries and frameworks are treated either as kind of commercial off-the-shelf COTS, or what we call software of unknown provenance, which is SOUP, acronym SOUP. Both of these are well-known things in the medical device world, and there are kind of regulations and guidances on how to deal with them. So you want to identify those kind of stuff. You want to identify how much risk these COTS or SOUP components are providing you in terms of total device risks or total therapy risk. Either way, you want to provide proper mitigations to put in place to reduce risk. Also, choosing the right software stack is important for cybersecurity reasons foremost, because if you find software that is not well supported, it becomes hard to kind of keep patching and keep plugging away when there are known vulnerabilities and known defects that prop up, or that could be utilized in an incident. Opt for libraries and frameworks that have large and vibrant community of developers, because then they contribute to stability and generally reduce your risk if they keep patching away properly. Or find things can be purchased at a reasonable cost that have some support behind them. Software design choices are also important. Understand the scalability and availability goals that you will need. Do you have large devices, or do you have less devices that send large amount of data, or you have lots of devices that send a small amount of data, or a combination of that? So kind of understand where you will need to scale, how much you will need to scale. Consider also that you may need a distributed system, because you may need different deployments in different countries for different regulatory requirements that we'll talk about. So think through scalability, think through availability goals. How much does your kind of backend need to be available? Does your device completely rely on that, or is your backend really more of a kind of data storage or adds value at a different point in time? If it's required for kind of your therapy to function, that puts a lot more risk and a lot more availability requirements around that. Think of data integrity and security always. prefer stateless architectures if you can. And then the last thing to consider is how are you going to patch your software. So once you have a software and connected device, one thing you can do is patch your software and firmware kind of off the shelf and off over the air or over the top updates as options, kind of for ease of deployment, and then also to guarantee security fixes. So always consider how your software updates will happen and design your software so it can be updatable over these means. It just keeps your security aspects much better. So once we talk through that, the next kind of scalability, security, and then the next thing to talk through is kind of regulatory consideration. So how do you classify your connected health components? So your devices generally, very well known kind of risk approach in terms of how you classify a device. Either it's a class 2, class 1, class 3, and there's regulatory pathways towards it, depending on whether you have any existing kind of device that you can point to. Whether you go 510K, you go PMA, stuff like that. But you connect a health component, how do you classify that? Do you classify it as a accessory to your device, in which case it essentially inherits the same classification as your devices, or is it a medical device data system, which is, at least in the FDA word, has a very specific definition, or is it what we call a clinical decision support system? Classification is important because it attaches kind of responsibilities and things you have to do and approvals you may need to get to your connected health aspect of your offering. The less burdensome classification, the better in terms of regulatory, although it may also come with constraints. So for example, the medical device data systems and the clinical decision support systems, both are categories that the FDA has recently kind of carved out. They come with benefits. For example, they are class 1 exempt. So there's no approval required. There is no filings needed. Makes bringing that to market much easier. But they do have constraints in terms of what they can do. So if you are using that system to provide kind of therapeutic or clinical decision, you may or may not be able to use those constraints. Again, I'm not a regular expert, but that's something to think through. You may also want to classify as pieces. So you may have your device classified, let's say, as a class 2, your algorithm classified as a class 2, but then the infrastructure maybe as an MDDS. So you can kind of use these kind of tactics to kind of figure out what your best way to bring your connected health component to market. And lastly, sometimes it may not even be a medical device. That one, I'm not 100% sure how it works. But we have, there's a lot of apps, for example, out there that are not regular at all. That may change soon, but that's an option as well, is to just not consider any kind of medical device. And then what most people think through when they think about connected devices is cybersecurity and privacy. So I want to spend some time through kind of thinking through those kind of considerations. Security is a big problem. As of last year, there was 572 security breaches in healthcare, which were essentially up 37% year over year. So that number of breaches are going up, and number of patient records that were impacted during those breaches is almost 37 million, and that's actually double the number from a prior year, which means that even though the security breaches are up, every breach on average is affecting more and more patient records. So that security is a big problem everywhere, but it's a big problem in healthcare. The risks, obviously, are loss of data, and loss of patient data can be a big problem. Loss of system availability, that's, in a sense, if you're using your backend systems to provide critical therapy support or maybe even using it to make your devices work, loss of system availability can be very, very problematic. Or using the connected health component to get to your device and essentially hack your devices. So those are kind of high level risks. Some of the information, patient information that is very, very valuable in kind of the black market is, names and addresses of patients, social security numbers, biometric data, and diagnostic data. Those are kind of high value items that are being targeted. And cybersecurity is an evolving thing, as we see in more and more things. New standards, new approaches always come through in mind. There's also a privacy aspect to it. and as we see over the last few years, a lot of regulators, a lot of governments are moving towards more and more privacy considerations. So there's a lot more requirements coming through. Some of the ones that we have right now across the globe, they differ in various ways. So if you are going to be a global device company, you have to consider a myriad amount of security and privacy laws, not just one part. Some of the laws and regulations we normally work with are things like HIPAA and HITECH. These are US laws targeting other things, but primarily patient privacy. GDPR, a European law that went in effect last year, or sorry, a year before that. Essentially a very wide-ranging privacy protection, nothing to do with healthcare, but healthcare is obviously included in that. But it's a very wide-ranging privacy protection laws. There's CCPA, there's Massachusetts Data Protection Law. A lot of states in the US have their own requirements. A lot of countries in the European Union, even though they have GDPR, have their own requirements. And then as you go more and more broader, it's a mess. There's also existing laws, long-term existing like COPPA, if you're dealing with children or any kind of minor data, about a minor patient, you have to think of that. Canada has the what they call Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, or PIPED. So again, different countries, different states within the countries or different localities have their own kind of privacy and security laws that you have to think through. And then the industry has tried to come through standards that hopefully address all these different things. It's hard, but they've tried. There is the ISO IC 27001 standard on how to manage information security. There's an addendum to that 27018 that adds more PII protection, mostly to kind of include some of the GDPR aspects to it. US federal government has the National Institute of Standards and Technology that produces quite a bit of cybersecurity related material, related frameworks. Again, cybersecurity is not a healthcare problem, and the kind of measures you take are no different from other places. But because healthcare data is one of the two more important or two more highly affected areas in terms of privacy, a lot of focus has to be given on cybersecurity. Also, traditionally, healthcare has been kind of behind in cybersecurity compared to, let's say, a financial world, like a banks and your credit agencies. They traditionally, not always, traditionally have done better job at cybersecurity than, let's say, hospitals or device companies. So we kind of playing catch up in the healthcare world to a lot of other industries around that. We also have some alliances or some industry groups, like the Cloud Security Alliance is a nonprofit that sets best practices for security assurances. And then we have a newer body, 3-4 years old, called HITRUST, that came out with a common security framework. It's interesting because what they try to do is essentially create a certification around some of the requirements in a wide range of things. For example, they look at HIPAA, they look at GDPR, they look at a bunch of other state laws, ISO, IC requirements, and then they essentially come up with a security framework that you can certify against. So they try to combine it so that when you say HITRUST certified, essentially means you are compliant to a bunch of other things. Cybersecurity, as said, that's a big deal, but there are some steps you can use to manage. So a lot of what I try to present here is essentially in those standards and regulations. I just try to extract that and kind of provide you here. A few things we always do in terms of privacy management and security management is start with risk planning assessment. You need to understand what the risks are before you can do anything about it. So risk planning assessment is very important. One thing we always advise companies to do is to start with a threat model. What a threat model does, essentially, it's like modeling anything. You're trying to figure out where your threats are, what the vulnerabilities are, and what can be utilized in kind of negative ways. And then what your harm that comes out of that threat assessment. So risk planning is super important. Always design with security in mind. Traditionally, people always design with performance in mind. Is my therapy going to perform? It's going to deliver enough amount of drug, enough amount of dosage, enough amount of electric shocks or whatever your therapy is, or is it going to provide an output to a patient or a provider in a certain amount of time? But also think of design security from the get-go, not as a afterthought. Right from the get-go, how do I secure the system? Developing a cybersecurity surveillance program is important, and we'll talk about what that means in a while in the next set of slides. But just like you have a device surveillance program, it's important to have a cybersecurity surveillance program. And then, very important, setting up appropriate agreements. A lot of these laws and regulations require that you have certain kind of agreements to both limit your liability, but also explain your responsibilities, what you're responsible for in terms of providing. So if you're selling your devices to a hospital, what are your responsibilities, if any, around those agreements? And then very important thing is to establish a culture of cybersecurity in your organization. So let's take a little bit deeper dive into these topics because they're super important. As I said, risk planning starts with reviewing what data elements are collected and how much of those fall under the definition of protected data, right? So how much of those I call protected health information, but it could be also just PII identification information. Different regulation have identified what is protected differently. But in general, if a piece of information, either by itself or in combination of other pieces of information, can be used to identify a person or a small group of people, that's reasonably can consider a protected information. For example, a name of person or the social security number are generally protected, but by itself. But also things like age, height, weight by itself. You say, if I just say there's a male 35 years old, that doesn't really identify someone. But if I start adding more parameters to it, 35-year-old male living in this zip code, going to this clinic, now all of a sudden you've narrowed down quite a bit. And that combination now can be protected. So what is protected is not just something that is identifying by itself, but also in combination of other things. So as a create a threat model, there are some really good tools. One of the ones I really like is the threat model. It's called threat modeling tool from Microsoft. It's pretty straightforward, has a lot of existing kind of vulnerabilities assessment, existing threats. So for example, if you have a server somewhere and you just use that server on your premise or server in the cloud, you can kind of drag and drop that server into a server model into that modeling tool, and it will assess kind of known risks around that. So it's a very good tool. Check it out. But start with a threat model, and that will give you a lot of insight into kind of your risk parameters around for cybersecurity. Assess vulnerabilities just like you do risk analysis on your device, right? In your therapy, in your diagnostic, whatever device you have. In terms of patient safety, here you do the same thing. Similar model, identify any kind of vulnerabilities, identify what the probability of those vulnerabilities exploiting, somebody exploiting those vulnerabilities, and then what are the risks or the harm that can happen in terms of either to the patient, to the provider, to any user, to your business. So think of those through. So that's kind of the process. And probability of event, again, obviously, there is no perfect, completely secure system. So always assume that somebody will hack into it, that somebody will exploit a vulnerability, but then the probability of that event, how possible that can happen is important enough for you to kind of figure out how much mitigations to put behind it. And then, as I said, design with security in mind. So I did think of things that you will need in your software solution or in your solution in general for security. For one is identify identity and access management. How do you know who the person is accessing the information? How will you provide kind of access control around that? Who knows what, who can access what? How you could keep track of that? How can you review that so you know that access management is still up to date, right? So identity itself can be a webinar by itself, but things most people use some kind of login, username, email address, password combination as identity, but think of other options, maybe biometrics, maybe a second factor or multi-factor authentication, stuff like that. To sort of talk about authentication, but also encryption. How much encryption do you need? The answer is pretty much always. When to encrypt? Do you encrypt it on device? Again, answer is always. But if sometimes you may run into potential constraints on the device itself that don't allow you to do encryption. So again, think of this when you consider your hardware, what kind of encryption support you need, and does your hardware support any kind of encryption option, right? Can it do hardware encryption? Can it facilitate enough memory, enough space to be able to do encryption? Do your performance of your device allow you to do encryption? And then important part of encryption is how do you manage keys? Because your encryption is only as good as your protection of the keys. So if you lose your key, then having a lock on a door doesn't really do much. So how do you manage the keys is as important as whether you encrypt or not. And then access controls, as we talk about, but also audit trails. So audit trails are important to be able to go back and kind of see how your system was used, which employee used it or which user used it. Important again, specifically internal access control, because as you have employee turnover, you want all of the roles change. You want to make sure that the access control is still appropriate. And then you'll be able to review those on a periodic basis. Audit trail is a requirement in pretty much most privacy regulations. And then last thing I want to talk about is keeping what we call a bill of materials, but for software. Very important. So we always do bill of materials for hardware. We know which registers, which processors, which boards to use, where they are, but we don't always think of software having a BOM. It's important specifically if you use kind of third-party components. You want to know exactly which version they are, what the vulnerabilities are there. You want to monitor those channels or those projects if you're using some third-party stuff, especially open source. If you have vendors, you want to make sure that they can periodically provide you with some kind of patching or some kind of updates to address security issues. So that's important. And also security testing. Just like we do performance testing, we do testing for the efficacy, testing for safety of the user. We want to test for security. That needs to be part of a design process to always test things like penetration testing or ethical hacking, for example. You want to understand what your security issues are before you go to market. Another thing I want to talk about is kind of post-surveillance program. So again, as we do with devices, once the device is on the market, you are generally required to have a surveillance program that includes, looking for any risks, any safety issues, looking for any potential problems, adverse effects, and then kind of managing that, maybe reporting it to the FDA, doing recalls and things like that. You need a very similar surveillance program, but for cybersecurity. And that includes, identifying cybersecurity risks, how to deal with them, what to do with them, how to notify users, things like that. FDA has a guidance document about cybersecurity surveillance program. It essentially points to the cybersecurity framework developed by the National Institute of Science and Technology. And it identifies 5 keys area. So it's very thoughtful. You identify the problems upfront as part of a risk assessment. You protect, so you put mitigations in front of those for those risks. You have a program or you have a process to kind of detect any cybersecurity issues going in operation, have the capability to respond appropriately, and then also the ability to recover quickly. So things like that, those add to your kind of operational requirements as ability to have a cybersecurity surveillance system so that you can or digital surveillance system so you can kind of see what's happening through your digital health aspect, and then the ability to have a cross-functional team that can quickly respond, lock down your systems, figure out what's going on, have appropriate understanding of the notification requirements in terms of, do you notify patients? Do you notify other users? Do you need to notify governments or regulatory agencies? And then recover. So having enough backups, enough kind of hot sites that you're able to quickly switch over and still keep up your devices and your infrastructure up while you kind of do more investigation into the problem. So that's kind of an important aspect. Also understand all different state, local, national, transnational requirements in terms of reporting, and use cross-functional teams always, because you need not just technical folks to respond, but you also need your quality aspects, your regulatory people, and your business people to be involved. and then ensure adequate business protection. So make sure you have enough insurance coverage to be able to protect around these things. A couple more things. One is set up appropriate agreements. This is important, also required under certain laws. The two ones that are most often used and under HIPAA is called the business associate agreement. This essentially allows, if you're using data, specifically if you're working with hospitals and stuff, when a patient consents to the hospital has access to our data, but they also could provide access to some business associate, given that you have an agreement with them. So that essential if your data is going to move out of the hospital into some kind of system that you manage and maintain. Also, data processing agreement, a very similar agreement, but it's generally done between the primary owner of the device, in case the device manufacturer generally, and any kind of vendors that may be processing that data on behalf of that vendor. And this includes big companies. Like, so if you are developing a system on top of AWS, for example, then you need a data processing agreement with AWS. You need a business agreement with AWS. So not only people who will actually have access to data, but any kind of infrastructure in the middle needs to have an agreement. These are important agreements because they're outlining responsibilities, but they also may limit your liability in some aspects. And the last thing I want to talk about is kind of establish a culture of cybersecurity. Very important and often an underappreciated aspect of security protection. So cybersecurity is not something you add on. It's something that has to be grown into your culture. You make sure you have training programs properly with the employees and your users. You make sure you design with cybersecurity in mind. So cybersecurity is a culture change that you need to make in your organization. It's not something you just add on, right? So it's from the get-go, from the design to operational to kind of post-market surveillance. Cybersecurity is important. And then once you figure out that you are going to build your system and you have all these requirements laid out in terms of hardware, software, regulatory, and cybersecurity, next thing is question is, are you going to build it in your own, or are you going to buy it? So age-old question. There are pros and cons. So if you build it, obviously you have a fully customizable solution. You have full control and ownership. There's a lot of pros around that. Cons are there's a lot of costs, specifically a lot of uptime costs, a lot of time in terms of development, and then any development comes with the risks. So you end up with a lot of work to do that. If you buy, the pros are completely essentially the opposite of the cons. They're cost effective, they're quick time to market, they offer risk reduction most of the time. The cons are obviously you may have to compromise on functionality, which may or may not exist in that particular solution. And then you will most likely not have full control and or ownership of that particular system or particular solution. If you do build, just make sure that you start, if you can, with some kind of general purpose infrastructure like AWS, Azure, etc., to at least use some of their systems and some of the storage functions they provide. Make sure you double the development under whatever compliance is required. Maybe do it more than you would think, because the regulatory aspect of digital health is still evolving. So what is not enforceable today may be enforced tomorrow. So try to see if you can always develop at a higher standard. Ensure all security aspects are dealt with in terms of configuration. Build an operational team that's skilled in cloud IT, because that's very important in terms of detection and stuff. Acquire and operationalize any kind of good security monitoring and detection tools, and develop a patching and disaster management plan. And then, as I said, set up appropriate business safeguards and agreements with anybody you work with in terms of the solution. If you're going to buy, think through what your solution will need in terms of compliance, or maybe higher compliance, and make sure that the solution you're buying was built to that kind of compliance. So due diligence, questions like, is the provider certified to appropriate standard? Has the product been developed under the compliance? What is the track record in terms of security and privacy? Is it available globally or just in a particular region? Do they meet kind of like local data protection laws and residency requirements and stuff like that? I guess we talked about that. And version control. So how do, specifically in a kind of SaaS model, how does version control work, right? So you build your development, you have your devices connected to version 1 of this tool, then the vendor goes and builds version 2. How do you access that? What the validation requirements are? How do you move from version 1 to version 2? A lot of that will also have to deal with kind of how you, what your risk profile is in terms of your own solution. But that's something to understand is what kind of support and version control does the vendor have. And then what responsibilities and liabilities the vendor takes on, and what commitments are they willing to make. That again is important for you to understand your risk and liabilities, but also what benefits you're going to get from that. Just a quick 2-minute on who we are. So we are a cloud platform that are purpose built on medical devices. And when I say cloud platform, we are not an infrastructure. So we actually use AWS as an infrastructure, but we essentially provide a fully built solution that you can essentially utilize by making your devices connect to our cloud and providing access to your stakeholders using our pre-existing kind of dashboards and stuff like that. Very customizable. We provide quick integration, flexible data workflows, so your workflows can kind of essentially be implemented within our system. We provide customizable web portals, so you can kind of provide access to that data or functionality directly to your end users. Things like data visualization and analysis are part of that. A customizable access control engine, so you determine quick and easy double click here, click there to figure out who has access and provide access to other people. Any kind of alerts automated you can set up. Customized branding, so it kind of looks like your product and not ours. And then any kind of custom modules is built to have plug and play extensions. So we can build custom modules for you, or you can build custom modules yourself for the system to kind of extend the capability of the system. Yeah, cost savings, on average, we provide about 72% cost savings versus kind of build your own option, and a lot of time savings as well. And then risk reduction, we build everything around highest levels of compliance. We are an ISO 13485 certified company, and we comply with HIPAA, GDPR, CCPA, and all the other regulatory requirements. We provide a certificate of compliance, provide audit support. So if FDA or any regulatory agencies come and audit you and they have questions about the cloud, we'll be on the phone or on the audit meeting and support that. Availability is our main goal. Security is we manage everything for you in terms of the disaster recovery and all that stuff. And then we provide cybersecurity liabilities, or we take on cybersecurity liabilities to an extent from you. So that's kind of overall what we are. And in conclusion, connected health is here to stay. So while the risks in terms of security, privacy, regulatory, and cost, the benefits in terms of convenience, patient compliance, better patient compliance, improved insights, and ultimately better health outcomes kind of far outweigh the risk. So I hope this presentation provided you with some insight into that journey, and I'm happy to take any questions. Before I do that, just there's our contact information. Do follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter. We do put out hopefully educational material that could be useful for your journey as well. I see a few questions. Brennan, do I just talk about it?
Yeah, sure. As far as the chat one, I saw one from David. Yes, if the recording would be available, it will be. And I will send that out to all the participants today after the webinar.
All right. So there's a couple of questions here. One question is, in the pandemic, due to the pandemic, the surge in telehealth, remote patient monitoring, how do you see medical devices being used by patient, and how to integrate EHR like Epic, Cerner, etc.? So yes, definitely. The pandemic has made telehealth and remote patient monitoring super important. Even before the pandemic, we kind of see this trend, what we call a commercialization of healthcare, or consumerization of healthcare. Sorry. What it means is, traditionally healthcare is always sold to, because of the kind of the insurance and how the payer market works, always sold to big, you sell your devices to the hospitals, and the hospitals will essentially, the doctors will essentially prescribe the devices to the end user. But we see a lot of moving into direct patient engagement. So you no longer have reps going into hospitals, but you have your marketing tools, traditional consumer marketing tools, directly targeting to patients. That always happened in some degree, specifically in the drug market. Even though you couldn't really sell drug directly to a patient, there was a lot of commercialization or kind of targeting to consumers. But the device market, that didn't happen as much. But that's what we see now, more and more direct sales and also a lot of targeting. So patients become super important in that decision-making process of what your device is. So we need to understand that. But just because you sell to patient doesn't mean that the data alone needs to be there. Data obviously, has to be shared with the provider, and a lot of the providers will have some kind of electronic health records. So when you build a system, think about that. There's a lot of standards out there on how to integrate with EHRs, FHIR being FHIR being one of the standards that's upcoming, that a lot of the EHR manufacturers have kind of agreed to implement. The implementation is not there yet, or it's a very varying degrees. It's not completely there, but it's a good way to have your solution compatible to some kind of EHR requirements, so that when you do have that need, your solution is ready to integrate. So think of that. Also think of other ways to share your information. Can your information be how much you want to share with the EHRs, how much you want to share with patients, and stuff like that. Another question: how do we make use of open source products and medical devices? So as I said, always start with the guidance documents. So there's the guidance documents on OTS, so off-the-shelf software, that can be used essentially for both commercial kind of on-the-shelf, but also open source, what we call SOUP products. And what the guidance documents always talk about, there's one from FDA, there's one from other places, but essentially the same methodology. Start with the risk that these components add to your solution, right? So if I'm going to use let's say a delivery mechanics, or a software that does delivery of data from point A to point B, what risk does it add to my product? And go through a risk analysis. And based on your risk analysis, if it's a minor risk, a moderate risk, or a severe risk, then you have steps to do, right? So if it's a minor risk, all you really need to make sure is that you test that, you do some validation. If it's a severe risk, that means now you have to ensure that that solution essentially complies with all the requisite requirements, which may be hard to do with an open source solution, or you take on responsibilities of making sure that compliance is managed, which is a lot of cost and effort. So start with kind of guidance document, figure out how much risk that particular component or system is applying or adding to your solution, and then just follow through kind of the guidance steps there. A lot of time that generally works. When we sell to our customers, we generally start with that model, or advise our customers to start with the model, and then we essentially provide them with whatever is needed. Because we have built full compliance, so we even support severe risk levels. But if you're using just open source, make sure that support is available, or that compliance is available. And then with the 21st Century Cures Act, how do you see adaptation and use of medical device with integration, smart on FHIR, etc.? Yes, so the 21st Century Cures Act essentially allows additional forms of data sharing that were questionable before. So HIPAA has in a lot of requirements in terms of privacy, and there was a lot of data sharing that was considered right or wrongly considered not available. With the Cures Act, there is some clarification, but that essentially allows a lot more integration of data into HR, and we see the adaptation still to be very slow. Partly because while this clarification in terms of data sharing, it's not quite sure what the liability reductions are. It's also not sure what the vendors themselves think through in terms of what the advantages of allowing data sharing. So if you're an Epic or you're Cerner, do you open up very easily? They have at least agreed to do that with the FHIR protocols. FHIR has a subset called SMART, so Smart on FHIR applications that make it much easier to share data. So we'll see. It's still, I'm still not, while it's a step in the right direction, I'm not sure that by itself it really solves a whole lot of adaptation issues, but I could be wrong about that. And then the last question that I see here is, can you explain how you partner with the medical device hardware manufacturers, especially in case for medical device OEM uses third-party hardware supplier? Sure. So we do partner with other vendors that kind of serve the same industry, or say a medical device manufacturer here. And it depends on different levels. We have partnerships where it's mostly having, like for example, we have software partners that build out integrations. They know our platform, they understand our platform, they train on our platform, and then we essentially, we have a customer that needs integration that may not be able to do it in-house. We essentially bring them in and provide that services to that. We for an OEM like that, for like a third hardware manufacturer, we may do things like try to build out our SDKs or our libraries directly into the sensors, so that when somebody buys a sensor or a board or stuff, it's essentially cloud ready to help that. We can definitely talk more. It will depend on the specifics. So if you want to reach out, that's my my email address. We can definitely talk about that. All right, that's all the question I see. Any others?
Abbas, I actually have a question. If
Yeah.
I was an attendee here watching today, what would you want to be my key takeaway from viewing today's event?
Yeah, so key takeaways, think of connectivity early on. If you are going to use connectivity, and there's a lot of, as I said, a lot of benefits and needs for that, think it early on. Don't postpone it to later, because even though you may not have a solution until later, a lot of decisions you make up front affect what kind of solutions you can have. So again, we talked about your regulatory approach, your hardware approach, your software on the approach. All that will depend or will have an impact on the ultimate solution that you add. So even if your connectivity is in your roadmap, even if it's version 2, version 3, at least start thinking about it upfront and make sure you are well prepared to go that. So don't postpone all connectivity thoughts until towards the end.
It's a really great feedback and really great comment. The audience looks like they're thanking you in the chat, and I also want to thank you today for taking the time to present to everyone. And also thank you everyone in the audience for taking the time to be here with us today.
Yeah, thank you. And hopefully this was useful.